Hi, I'm Ryan.
And I'm Margaret.
We're going to talk about the listening process.
And I'm going to talk about the listening styles.
Cool. So first I'm going to start, and I'm going to get into the difference between listening and hearing. Listening is, well, first let's talk about hearing. Hearing is constant and happens automatically, the same way we're always breathing and our heart's beating. Listening is different because it means you're actively paying attention. Listening requires action, like flipping a mental on switch, so that you can decode and process the meaning of a message and retain what you've heard. Now that we've talked about the difference between listening and hearing, let's talk about processing. Processing has to do with your ability to think about what you're hearing. As an audience member, if you pay attention to body language, attitude, tone of voice, along with the words that are being said, you will be able to process more efficiently. By relating what you're hearing to your own personal experience, you'll be able to make better judgments and decisions for yourself. As a speaker, paying attention to verbal and nonverbal cues such as side chat, eye rolling, crossed arms, you'll be able to modify your message so it can be received better. Now that we've talked about processing, let's talk about retention. Retention is your ability to actually remember what you've heard. Studies have shown that people who are actively paying attention are more likely to retain the message. In a 10-year study, poor listeners showed a pattern called the attentiveness curve. In the study, people with poor listening habits tend to not pay attention at the beginning of a presentation, followed by a spike in attention, probably because they realize they should have been paying attention, only to return to low attentiveness again, and then not return paying attention until the end of the speech. The study revealed that people with poor attention habits tend to remember very little, less than 25% of what they heard, and of that, could recall or tended to be confused about even less. All this means that if you're not actively paying attention, you're not likely to retain much, if any, of what you've heard. Now let's bring back Margaret.
Hey! So I'm going to be talking about the different listening styles. Listening styles are the different ways that people listen to and retain information. People tend to default to a specific listening style out of habit, and by learning about the different styles can help us use them to our advantage. As a speaker, it's important to be able to identify your audience's listening styles because that way it'll help you develop and deliver your speech better and reach them more effectively. As an audience member, it is important to recognize your own listening style because that way you can improve your listening skills. So the first type of listening style that we'll talk about is the action-oriented. These guys are also known as critical listeners because they like to get straight to the point. They dislike it when people ramble or take a really long time to get to the point of their message, but instead prefer direct, precise, and error-free messages. These types of listeners don't really care about who the speaker is. They care more and are more motivated by learning about what the agenda and the action required is. The second type of listening style that we'll talk about is the content-oriented. These guys are all about learning about what the content of the message is. They like in-depth, complex, and detail-oriented messages. And similar to the action-oriented listeners, they don't really care about who the speaker is. They're more intrigued by what the content is. So they're more likely to go home and do their own research into the matter and talk about it with their friends. The third listening style that we'll talk about is the people-oriented. These guys like to get all up in your business. They're more personal listeners, and they like to create and strengthen relationships. They tend to express more empathy towards the speaker. So unlike the action-oriented and content-oriented listeners, they care about who the speaker is. So it's important to note that if this is your listening style, you need to take into consideration that the topic that the speaker is talking about is important to them. On the other hand, as a speaker, it's important to notice that these types of listeners care about what you're talking about. So it's important to give a truthful and ethical message. The fourth and final listening style that we'll talk about is the time-oriented listeners. These guys want to get to the point as fast as possible. They don't like dilly-dallying. They don't like people who take really long time. They don't like people who take a really long time to get to the point, and they can become rushed. They can become rude or even hostile if they're expected to listen longer than they've expected to. Some nonverbal cues that these listeners can give off are checking their watch, looking at the clock, checking their cell phone, fidgeting, and other rude things. It's important to take these types of listeners into consideration when you're delivering your speech, because if your speech contains too much information or if it's too long, you can expect these types of listeners to lose interest quickly. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Taylor, and today I'm going to be covering poor listening. Poor listening is something that we all engage in from time to time, and I'm going to be covering common forms of poor listening and things that people do every day. One form of poor listening is going to be unprocessed note-taking. Unprocessed note-taking is when you are basically listening to a speaker, but you are not listening to what they're saying. You're just writing what they're saying down straight to your notebook, and you're not processing the information or retaining it. You're physically hearing words, but they're just going straight from the speaker's words, not even into your ears at all. Another form is going to be non-listening. This is a very common form of poor listening. Non-listening is when you are simply not paying attention at all to what you're hearing. If you're more focused on your own thoughts about a subject, then you are engaging in non-listening. Non-listening prevents you from processing another person's message or retaining it. So make sure when you're listening to somebody that you try your hardest to listen to what they are saying. A very common form of poor listening is going to be argumentative listening. This is when you feel in conflict with somebody who is speaking and you already know what you're going to say when they're finished speaking. This is something that even public speakers can get engaged in as well. They may feel attacked by someone who's asking them questions, someone in the audience. If they don't listen to what the question is fully, they may feel offended and cut them off, which is something that you don't want to do and could definitely lose credibility when you're a public speaker. Another form of, argumentative listening, another common example is listening to only enough as you need to fill your own arguments. And lastly, the most common form of poor listening is going to be interruptive listening. This, I'm sure we've all done and has happened to us multiple times. So interruptive listening is when one person constantly interrupts the other person, whether you're speaking or you're just talking to a friend and you can tell that they are just waiting to say what they want to say. Speakers who don't acknowledge people asking questions can also be interruptive listeners. Like I said before, they can just cut them off and not listen to what they want to say fully. When you voice your opinions or blurt out questions before the speaker is ready to answer them, you're also engaging in interruptive listening. So make sure to not interrupt when somebody is speaking and try to listen to fully what they're saying and not just nod your head and be ready to answer right away. Listen to what they have to say and even wait a few seconds after somebody has said what they're going to say to make sure that they're completely finished. And if you do this, hopefully people will do it back to you and you can learn how to be a better listener and a better speaker.
Hi, my name is Sydney, and today I will be discussing how to best maximize an audience's listening when you are the speaker. To do this, you can use something called audience surveillance, which is essentially paying attention to an audience's verbal and nonverbal cues. If done effectively, this will help you to both anticipate and counteract poor listening. So, when you are preparing your speech, analyze your audience. Consider who you will be speaking to and in what context. For instance, think about their probable energy and attention levels. If you're presenting at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, people are likely to be tired and unfocused. With this in mind, you can plan to keep your message short and direct. Similarly, consider your audience's likely prior knowledge on your topic. If they will know little, make sure to incorporate explanations of all key terms and concepts. On the flip side, don't waste time or potentially offend anyone by explaining, for example, what a mitochondrion is to a group of career biologists. And lastly, consider any potential language barriers that your audience may encounter. For instance, you speaking to them in a language which may not be their first, and adjust your word choice and volume accordingly. While you're preparing, you'll be making a lot of educated guesses, some of which may end up being incorrect. But simply having these issues on your radar will help you to deliver a more effective speech. When you are standing in front of the audience and giving your speech, use 3 main ideas to encourage active listening. First, pay attention to factors which you can control. These include your voice, volume, projection, fluency, rate of speaking, and timing. Also, try to maintain eye contact when it is culturally appropriate. Avoid obtrusive gestures such as pointing at the audience, and always face the group. Secondly, keep an eye out for something called defeated listening, which is when someone feels overwhelmed by your message and thus cannot follow it. Audiences receiving particularly detailed or technical speeches will be susceptible to this. As you present, look around your room and take note of anyone who avoids your eye contact or is working on something else as you speak. Once you have identified this type of listening in individuals, you can pause occasionally to ask questions and thereby test their ability to follow your message. If this still fails and your audience seems completely lost, you can always back up and repeat your message with different examples or simpler terms. And lastly, beware of superficial listening, which is when someone pretends to pay attention but is actually distracted. As you begin, ask the audience to turn off their cell phones and resist checking for messages on other devices. As you present, maintain eye contact with anyone you sense is particularly distracted, because watching a person motivates them to pay more attention. And lastly, you can always ask questions or invite the audience to ask their own to enhance engagement with your speech. Thank you for your time, and I hope that I have helped you to further your understanding of how to maximize your audience's listening.
Hi, I'm Hamda, and today I'll be talking about becoming a better listener. So what do you have to do to improve your listening skills? What are the steps you need to follow? The first thing I want to talk about is filtering out distraction. In any speaking situation, there are many distractions, both external and internal. External distractions include street noise, chattering audience, chatting classmates, and any moving objects in the class that might distract you from the teacher, from the speaker. So when you're listening, you want to make sure you're not looking around, you're not trying to pay attention to what other people are saying, just focus on the speaker. Internal distraction are thoughts that come to your head that make you lose focus. So let's say, for example, you forgot something at home and you're thinking about that instead of focusing on the speaker. This is going to affect how you hear. So make sure you block all that other stuff from your head and you focus on the speaker. Second thing I want to talk about is focusing on the speaker. So when you're listening, you want to make sure you're not thinking about what you're going to say next. You should always think about what the speaker is saying. What does that mean to you? Ask yourself if you agree with it or disagree with it. And make eye contact and avoid any non-listening situation. The last thing I want to talk about is when you're listening, you want to show the speaker that you're listening. How do you do this? So you don't want to be that one person that stares at the speaker and nods their head, smiles when they actually don't understand what's going on. You want to make sure that you're asking important questions. You're communicating with them. When you have the chance to talk to the speaker, you want to raise your hand and ask them to clarify anything that you don't understand. These things that I've talked about are going to help you become an interactive listener. They're going to help with your processing and retraining information. So make sure you use them, and then you will see the results. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Dongwon. Let me talk about listening. Especially listening is very vital skill when you live in the communication world. But this time I'll talk about especially listening when you are inside the audience. This goes well with especially students who takes classes in the classroom because they always listen when they are in the audience and they listen to the professor's lecture. So when it comes to listening, they after most of the time then the listening process ends, they often, especially in American school, they give a speech critic. Speech critic means a oral or written feedback given after a speech, and a speech critic is essential part of the speech in that it lets the speaker understand better about his speech behavior itself. And in order to understand more about speech critic, we need to identify the main points. Like there are some main 3 to 4 main sentences in the sentence that says the main points in the lecture. So the writer often states it in the introduction and signal them in the body paragraph with transition and then restate it in the conclusion. That's the main part. And in order to identify main points, we need to consider objective. Such objectives, I mean, there are some general rhetorical purposes of the speech, such as to inform, to persuade, and to mark a special occasion. So, and it is, and then we should give a specific examples when you find out how the writer approaches the goal. And then supporting feedback with examples, such as there are some examples about like, is this better? You had better say like not just good eye contact, but you had better say like you made eye contact with every person in the classroom, and then that's such as like, I see your point, and but your organization is difficult to follow, such like that way to say the really specific examples with supporting feedback. Finally, you should be ethical when you give comments late after a speech, such as when you should be ethical, there are when it's like basically you should treat the other speaker as you hope or expect to be treated. So like when you should be courteous, and you should not prejudge the topics before he or she makes the speeches, and even if you disagree with something in the speech, you should say this with courteously, and that it should not sound like a personal attack, though it seems like basic, but to be ethical is the thing we cannot be neglected. This today is a great day, and I talked about how to become a better listener. This point is very important when you live with a life partner or whatever person you live with, to listen to whatever the topic you're not interested in or something, but you should push yourself to listen more carefully, not like your argumentative listening or like such agenda-driven listening. You should like not focus on your main thoughts, but focus on the message itself, and then you should give your comments like speech critic, and don't forget to identify your main points, consider objectives, support feedback with examples, and be ethical. This was Dongwon, and thank you for listening to my presentation.